Hi everyone, thank you so much for waiting for this incredible chat today. My name is Fezo Mtonti. I'm the Performing Arts Programmer here at The Forge. If you haven't seen this channel before, if you are newly watching today, I just want to give you a sense of what The Forge is. The Forge is a multi-use cultural center in Braamfontein in Johannesburg. We are on 87 Dakota Street. We are a Pan-African progressive feminist cultural center. We believe that the cultural is, in fact, the political. We think that the cultural is the historical, is the sociological. And so we always start our interventions whether they be in the context of the political or in the social justice / activist space, through the cultural. And we are so proud of that fact. Across the road, we have a incredible space called the Commune Bookshop. The Commune Bookshop was named after the Paris Commune, which we are still celebrating, if you didn't know. It's the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, and that was an important moment politically and historically in the broad movement of the political life of the left. And we are so deeply honored to carry the name of the Paris Commune in that shop. But to also give you a sense of that shop, we have very important progressive literature, which we have ordered in very specific and definitive ways that allow us to think about progressive politics. And this is a range of progressive politics. It is a Pan-African shop, and the Forge is also a Pan-African center. But we think that the global is, in fact, the Pan-African. And so, in as much as there's a lot of Pan-African literature there, there is also a lot of global and South African literature present. So pop by. We have some amazing events coming up this week at the Commune. We have the ESCOM dossier, which has been produced brilliantly by Tricontinental. And we also then have the Indaba Is launch, which we're so excited about. Please make sure to check out the Commune JHB channels for that. Today, though, we are in the Forge, as you can see, and we are about to have an extraordinary conversation with Zukiswa Mandela. I hope she doesn't need introduction to those of you who are watching, but if she does, Zukiswa Mandela is one of, I think, the most important popular historians in South Africa at the moment. I think she really typifies what it means to be a public intellectual in the truest sense. So if you are on Twitter, you will have seen Zukiswa Mandela's threads that are so important because they do the interesting thing, which I think arts journalism does. Bridges the historical and the social and the cultural, right? In fact, Zukiswa Mandela, who I'm now going to call Zukona because it's too long, is the consulting historian at The Forge. And so she makes us look very smart and allows us to think a little bit more deeply about our programming. So we're so excited to have her both as a friend, but to have her as a real definitive political intellectual and a definitive historian. And it's so exciting that a young person is doing so much work in the archive. And when we talk about the archive, we're not talking about the brick and mortar thing. We're talking about in the re-memory of South African, and global historical and political thought. So thank you so much for joining us, Zukona. Today we are going to be speaking about Winnie Madikizela Mandela. I think it was in 2018, on this exact date, that was her funeral. And, you know, that was, I think in many ways, a deeply contested time in South Africa. Those of us will remember the ways in which Black women held space for the memory of Madikizela Mandela. held space for the ways in which, when she was alive, her memory politically had been erased, had been tarnished, had been spoken for by folks that had absolutely no regard for the real servitude that she gave us as South Africans, but I think us as folks on the continent. So today we're going to speak about her role in this sense. Today we're going to speak about what it is, in fact, to think about the memory of Winnie Mandela in this moment, but also because, you know, Easter Sunday, Easter Friday just happened. And so we think that there are actual political and spiritual links that we need to speak to when thinking about this extraordinary, I'm going to say vernacular intellectual in the way that Grant Farrad uses the term, but Zukiswa can elaborate because that is part of her extraordinary thesis on Winnie. So to jump straight into it, I'm curious about what your conception of the story of Easter is in relation to Winnie, especially because I think it was when was it? Just on quite recently, you did a thread with Brenda Fassi and on Good Friday, right? And you tracked that moment in 1999 when Vulindlela, I think, is the soundtrack of the ANC. But you track this moment politically, and I think it's an important popular culture moment, but it's also an important, I think, religious, not religious in the kind of like tight, ossified way, but it's an important spiritual moment as well. So maybe some of your reflections there.
Thank you, Fizzy, for your introduction, and yeah, thank you for having me this evening. And I think as you were speaking, and I think also just when I think about her, Umabujan, I think about the fact that, you know, I think about that last part in Umbedesho, that says, Nkosi ndithembe wena, mandingaze ndidaniswe. And I think, you know, when I think of just reflecting on this moment 3 years on, and reflecting on the work of so many people to kind of reinstate her to her rightful place as a liberator, as a healer liberator as well, you know, when you think of her work as a social worker and the kinds of stuff that she did within that space, and the vilification that followed in the late 80s, and the ways in which she's kind of been written out of our history. I think this moment sitting today, and also the moment, you know, that the moment that was her death, that brought forth, you know, black women in particular, who kind of, you know, fought so hard to defend her memory and to reinstate her to this place where we are thinking far more deeply about her. You know, I can't help but think of that line, you know, Lord, I trust in you, may I never be shamed. And I think we are living in the time, we are writing and we are archiving in the time where we are defending against that shame. I think a couple of days into, just after she had passed away, I sent a message to her personal assistant, Umamzodwa Zwane, who helped me, you know, get access to her so I could interview her. You know, I sent just like a message in which I was just reminded of, you know, of a verse in the Bible. I'll think of the psalm, the specific psalm, when it gets to me. But this idea of vindicate me, O Lord, and I think that's the life of Mam Winnie, especially in the 90s. You know, I mean, when we think about her silences, you know, her refusal to defend herself as well, I think in a way is sort of prophetic work, in the sense that she's saying, I'm not going to say anything. The people who know me, the the people who do the work of amplifying the contributions of black women will do that, will vindicate, will make sure that I am not shamed. And I think to sit here 3 years later, I think speaks to that, speaks to the ways in which, you know, we have sort of been this buffer, where platforms like The Forge, where just activists just doing their work, doing their writing and so on, have worked towards preventing, sort of being that space that says, no, you're not gonna do this anymore. We are going to reinstate this woman to the space that where she belongs, as one of the most important figures of the anti-apartheid movement, as a figurehead of the liberation movement. So yeah, and I think for me, you know, when I think about the spiritual aspect of, you know, of umama, you know, I think more than anything, and also listening to you, and I hope we don't stick to the script too much, but I think, you know, I've been reflecting a lot leading up to this moment where we're having this conversation about why it is that Christianity sticks. You know, even as a number of people, I mean, we know that Christianity and colonialism in this country and many parts of the global South go hand in hand. And we know that there are people who reject it. We know that not just reject it in this moment, but also as it was imposed on black people. We know that there are those that reject it. We know that there are those who also marry the two concepts. And I think of the prophet Nzikana, who died in 1821. So this year is the 200th anniversary of his death. But there are also those who kind of accepted this thing. And I think when I think of Mam Winnie and I think of her intellectual work, I think of her activist work, I think also of the fact that there's something about Christianity, specifically the aspects of fellowship, that are so important in terms of the anti-apartheid movement, in terms of the anti-colonial movement, that stuck with black people, mainly because there already is a pre-existing ethos of fellowship, you know. We call it Ubuntu. And, you know, and I think, you know, with Mam Winnie, she's somebody who throughout her activism is denied that. But also, the hallmark of her activism is a pursuit of fellowship. And when she talks, I mean, when you interview her, when you watch any of her interviews, one of the things that stands out, that should stand out for all of us, is the ways that she would always say, you know, I'm not alone. I don't walk alone. I was part of the masses who engaged the enemy. You know, she'll mention names. She'll mention names of people that influenced her, people that were mentors to her, and also her colleagues, black women in particular. And I think she's very deliberate in doing that because she understands the ways that women are erased, because she was at risk of that very erasure as a wife of one of the most important men in the mid-20th century onwards. So I think one of the most important things, you know, and I think the reason why, you know, we're having this conversation and sort of marrying her with this aspect of the religious, the aspects of her faith and so on, is because I think her life was lived in pursuit of that fellowship. You know, she's somebody that already comes out of a family that are converts, you know, strategic converts, as because I think and I think we don't actually speak much about that, much about that conversion, and we also, and I think in having this conversation specifically focusing on her faith, we also bring into the spotlight the work of her maternal side. Her mother, I mean, she didn't have an opportunity to be raised by her mother throughout her life because she passed away at such a young age. And also, Winnie was also young when her mom passed away. And there's also the mum, you know, her grandmother, who was Methodist and so on. And there's a lot about, you know, her aesthetic, her fashion aesthetic is very much influenced by that maternal side. But I think the thing that I think really stands out for me when I think of Mum Winnie as a faithful servant is very much the pursuit of fellowship and the ways and how she finds that through activism. Because when you're someone as visible as she is, you're also somebody who is going to be harassed at the level that she was. And therefore, you know, the ability to kind of gather with people in conventional ways was impossible for her. And therefore, there was always moments, whether it was in Soweto in the 60s and 70s, and then in Brandfort in the late 70s and 80s, and back in Soweto again, she's always just in pursuit of that fellowship. And I think, you know, it's one of the ways that I think about how, you know, when I'm trying to retrace how Christianity stuck, I think when I think of just the general ethos of Ubuntu that Black people have, and the ways in which they were able to then incorporate this thing that was imposed on them, and to then sort of turn it around and make it fit into their lives.
I really want to, you know, before we move on, I think there's some really interesting things that you're bringing to the fore here. This idea of being in pursuit of fellowship, which is a phrase that you've said continuously. And I want to maybe trouble the notion that we just kind of received the story of, you know, the colonial Christ. Because I think, in fact, what Black people have done, and folks in the global South, with the story of Christ, okay, so we get it. If you don't believe in Jesus, that's fine. That's fine. Marx says religion is the opiate of the masses. We get it. But if we believe the actual story, all right, like, so let's take this as the story. If we believe the story of Christ, we recognize that, in fact, this was an insurgent, or this was an enemy to the Roman state. And so the reason he gets crucified is because of the many ways in which he's thinking about radical love, right? And so we kind of had this conversation when we were watching the Sobukwe documentary at the Commune. And Cornel West says that the reason why Sobukwe has been erased from the memory of South Africa is because his entire methodology of political inquiry and political praxis was around radical love, right? Was around being fundamentally a humanist, right? And so if the story of Jesus Christ fits quite similarly to that, to me, then the pursuit of fellowship is the story that Winnie inevitably is going to take on, you know? Because in fact, she is a direct enemy of the state, right? And so the story of Christ really resembles her life in so many fundamental ways. Because what Christ is doing is he's talking about, you know, I mean, one of the like most obvious images of Christ is when he's quite young and he goes to the temple and he just watches, I'm calling capitalism in the temple, right? And he says, this is absolutely abhorrent. And, you know, he starts to like throw things and so on. And in fact, that is the story of someone who's recognizing that this is inappropriate behavior. And we hear of that story pretty early, you know. And so to me, when I look at the ways in which Black women fellowship and their resilience in fellowship, I think of that story of Christ. I don't think about the fantastical ways that supposedly Christianity absolves us of the sins that we might have created. In fact, I think, you know, the story of Christ is to tell us that there are direct ramifications for the evil worlds in which we live, but we must still have faith that a better world can happen, you know? And so in your conversation around remembering and actually remembering the story of Winnie or Umam Winnie, you know, how do you think she posits this fantastical story of heroic masculinity? And the reason I'm going to use heroic masculinity is because I want to speak about the ANC's heroic masculinity in a little bit. But in fact, the story of Christ is about, hey man, this divine hero. And so what does it mean for black women to approximate the same modalities of these kinds of heroic masculinities in relation to their pursuit of fellowship?
I think just flowing from your from just what you mentioned about, you know, this Christ that is young. You know, the first thing that, you know, she made clear when we met was my youthfulness was so important to how I engaged the enemy, to how I participated in the liberation movement. So, because we have to understand that Mam Winnie was marrying somebody who was twice her age. Dada was born in 1918, she was born in 1936. So that's exactly twice her age. The spaces that he sort of, you know, his friends, the people that he mingled with, and therefore she mingled with when they were dating, were twice her age. All those women born in, you know, Mam Sisulu born also in 1918, Mangoyi born in 1911, Helen Joseph born in 1905. So many of her peers are much older than her. And she understood that the thing that was going to be an important part, an intrinsic part of her activism and her longevity was her youth. And also, speaking to this idea of a Christ who challenged the state, I think also we must not forget that he challenged even the people within his faith. And they were also such an important part of his crucifixion. You know, we know that part of the, you know, of Pontius Pilate washing his hands off this situation and going, okay, well, I'm not going to get in it. Because there are people within within the faith from which Jesus kind of emerges, that are saying we want his blood. And we also need to think about, you know, Mangutjana in the same ways, the same movement she served is the same movement that burned her. You know, in the end, when it could see that, okay, fine, perhaps this is the moment in which we can now dispose of this individual. You know, the ANC plays its own role in doing that, you know. And ironically, you know, it also becomes the space that tries to use her, perhaps to kind of, because at the time of her death, you know, or just before, with the local elections and so on in 2016, she's sort of that sole symbol of what the ANC represented before it took power in 1994. And so she becomes this thing from which this ANC can extract from. So I think when we think about her, we need to think about also the ways in which the same movement that, and I asked one of her grandchildren, because she said this, she said, at her house, there is this, you know, there's the ANC flag that blows just above her balcony. And I asked her about that flag, and she said, well, you know, I will die ANC. And they will take that flag and they'll put it over my coffin when I die. And I asked the family what that could have, you know, why that couldn't happen. And of course, the obvious answer is this was a state funeral and everything. I mean, obviously some compromises had to be made. But I think there's something about her, even as she's extracted from, there's something about her embodiment of the ANC flag, of the ANC, that somehow just hits a nerve in this country, you know. So that challenging of the state that we were just talking about, but also even us also not forgetting to hold the ANC accountable for the ways it burned her, but also her taking on this thing when she takes it on, when she embodies the ANC, when she embodies the green, black and gold, all of a sudden it becomes this moment of resistance. Like we're having this moment now, 3 years after a funeral, and how in that moment, for a brief time, in the post-apartheid dispensation, those colors become a moment of defiance. Those colors become a moment of something radical, probably far more radical than we've ever seen in the entire existence of the movement. But with her, she kind of takes it on, and it becomes this last gut punch to the state, this last gut punch to the establishment, an establishment that the ANC in government has kind of assimilated to. And she sort of takes it on. And I'm interested in that in that conversation, what that moment might mean, even though that flag is not laying in her coffin. Just that act of black women wearing dukes, for example. Just that act of black women, even if they take those ANC colors and they put them on their head. You know, I'm just thinking of that of that moment 3 years ago, and some people talking about it on Facebook. You know, people I follow on Facebook or Twitter saying that, you know, their bosses demanded that they take that thing off. You know, that last moment of sort of reinvigorating a radical culture that had for so long been dead. You know, a resurrection moment, if you will. So yeah, I don't know. I'm thinking out loud, and I'm thinking sort of in scattered points. But I think that youthfulness that we were just talking about, you know, and also just the ways, because I think at her wedding, for example, they sang Liza Lise, and this hymn that in some ways became an anthem of the liberation movement. You know, she became that embodiment of what it means to make manifest something. You know, to sort of make manifest the aspirations of black people, of black women, throughout her activism. You know, her refusal to be in the shadow of this towering man, who's literally towering because he's so tall, but also just towering in terms of his, you know, his persona and his status in the Defiance campaign, and how she takes that on, but also redefines it to be, you know, and redefines what, you know, freedom could be for women, what the aspirations of freedom could be for women and for young people.
Yeah, you're going to take me so nicely to my next point. I just want to note, though, in our YouTube chat, we're just going to put up the playlist that Zukiswa so brilliantly asked us to curate today. And thank you so much, Lendo, who is the co-manager of the shop at the Commune. So you can catch it on the Commune Spotify, or rather Spotify account that belongs to the Commune, because some of the songs that Zukiswa is speaking about right now are there. And then also, if you have a question for Zukiswa, please drop it into the YouTube chat, and we will ask that once we've kind of not once we've ended the conversation, but yeah, we'll ask that towards the end. Okay, so I want to kind of think through the last points that you spoke about, I'm going to bring Raymond Suttner's Recovering Democracy in South Africa book into the conversation, and his chapter on Mandela's masculinities. Okay. If everyone can indulge me, I'm just going to read relatively quickly, but hopefully thoughtfully what his thoughts are on Mandela's masculinities, and I would like you to reflect about them afterwards. So he writes on the 13th of December 2013, he says, "The main biographies of Nelson Mandela do not consider him as a gendered subject. Yet, in these times of widespread violence perpetrated by men, we may learn from Mandela's model of masculinity the type of man he represented. But he changed a lot as his conditions altered, and he changed as a human being. Consequently, we are not dealing with a person whose identity as a man can be reduced to one quality that endured over time. Men have always dominated the ANC at a formal political level. The discourse of the organization has reflected masculine idioms. Mandela was part of the rebellious Youth League tradition, which attacked the ANC leadership of the time while embracing the same masculinist imagery, one of overcoming the emasculation of African men and recovering manhood. Mandela came to embody a heroic martial tradition in underground and military activities of the ANC, an image he shared later with younger people such as Chris Hani. This fighting image is foreshadowed in the notion of Mandela being a boxer, a role with wide township appeal, in some ways akin to the admiration for tsotsis, and Mandela was a flashy dresser like the tsotsis and the musicians of the 1950s. At one of his most heroic moments as he faced the possibility of the death sentence, Mandela directly related the willingness to die to his manhood. "If I must die, let me declare for all to know that I will meet my fate like a man." We can't take the use of man here only literally. In the context of apartheid subjugation, which made boys of men, such as the reference to manhood was also a statement of personhood, of someone with dignity and agency otherwise denied by the white ruler, who saw Africans as children in relation to adult whites. Okay, so this is the part where it gets a little bit interesting. Mandela acted out what has been called a heroic masculine project. This refers to men leaving home to embark on courageous deeds such as war and conquest, leaving their womenfolk behind to care for the children and undertake domestic tasks. At the same time, his wife, Nomzamo Winnie Mandela, along with many other women in South African political history, refused to conform to the conventional image of the wife waving her husband goodbye. Whatever the ambiguities, ambivalences, and controversy attached to her activities, Winnie carved out an independent political identity both underground and publicly. As for Winnie and his family, Mandela felt that he had not been there to fulfill a conventional protective role because of his incarceration from the early 1960s. So there's a lot there. But Tukona, I want to talk about heroic masculinity as this thing where we're told the men go and they fight for our liberation. It's why the ANC believes that they will get our votes until Jesus comes, right? That's in their own words. Because they left the home. They left the home. They don't talk about the way in which apartheid, colonialism constructed it so that black men have to leave the home. They don't tell us about that. They tell us that they went and fought for our liberation. And especially the story of exile, right? Which is often where the ANC really gets its gravitas. And they forget, for example, all the people that stayed at home. They forget the UDF. They forget the various groupings across South Africa that consistently made the work of resistance possible. Apartheid didn't end because suddenly Jesus was found. Apartheid ended because it got too expensive to oppress black people, right? And so what does it mean when women use the home as the site of resistance? And what does it mean for Winnie Mandela?
I think here I want to bring in Masisulu here, because, you know, she and Udada, they were born in the same year, and therefore their centenaries were in the same year. And we saw a very amplified, you know, spectacular celebration of Udada, and barely anything when it came to Masisulu. And yet, you have the person, and the thing is, the difference between these two is that one of them did the most work to bring this freedom into existence, and that was Masisulu. And the thing about the function of exile, the function of incarceration on Robben Island, especially when we think about how our history turned out, is that these spaces really didn't do much compared to the work and what Mawuni says, the fact that ordinary black South Africans were just the cannon fodder of the movement, you know. And I think she uses that deliberately, because these are people who remain unnamed and uncelebrated, compared to people who just were not here, you know. And this is not about diminishing exile or diminishing incarceration during the time, because incarceration in relation to Dada was a silencing. He was silenced for many years when he was on Robben Island, along with the leadership that was taken there. And so they were prevented from doing the kind of activism that they would have done if they weren't incarcerated. Or when you think of someone who went through something a bit worse than that, Sobukwe, you know, the fact that he was imprisoned, and every time the time came for him to be released, he was re-imprisoned because of those clauses. So what I'm saying is the incarceration was a form of silencing, but the problem with the 1990s and the lead up to democracy is that all of a sudden that work that was being done in the home, the work that was being done by the mothers, the work that was being done by the wives and just ordinary people who started, you know, sort of regrouping in the 1960s, all of that just flew out the window. All that labor, all that work of saying, if we relate it back to Mangutjana, all that work of now saying we're going to rally around this figure. The reason the country and the world rallies around Matiba particularly is because there was somebody who was visible, who came forth after 1964 when these guys were sentenced and incarcerated on Robben Island. Somebody came forth and emerged as this figurehead of the movement. And the problem with the ways that we write history, the problem with being so wedded to a nationalist history that glorifies masculinity, is that what we do is that we diminish the importance of that coming forth, that work that women now did, that disruption of ideas of how people organize, the men at the forefront. You know, apartheid disrupted that. The incarceration of these leaders disrupted that. But that didn't worry the women because they came forth, they did the work. And then the problem now after 1990 is to pretend like that work didn't matter, to pretend that this iconic figure that emerges when he's released from Victor Verster is just some kind of magical thing that took place, as opposed to the work and the labor of which black women, and in particular uMangutjana, was at the forefront of. So I think, we are yet to write about and think seriously about what it meant for women to kind of reorganize, because I think women were very much at the forefront of these movements regrouping. When these movements went underground, you think of people like Nomvo Boy, Engobo, who are working and are at the forefront of activism and underground activity in the Eastern Cape, where the PAC was a stronghold. And then you have people like Mam Winnie, you have people like, Mangoyi and so on, who are holding the fort in Gauteng, and the ways, especially Mam Winnie, because she understands this guy's big, he's towering, right? And she knows that it's either you disappear in his shadow or you emerge and you exploit that massive public persona that is Utata. And the thing about her is that she lays her body on the line. She's this sacrifice that isn't quite a sacrifice, because she knows that the apartheid government can't kill her, because there's this massive man behind her, right? This man that she was behind because he was so big during the Defiance campaign, and then he disappears and she emerges, and she exploits the fact that he is still big because they can't touch her the way that they can someone like Steve Biko. Because we have to also remember, I always say this, Steve Biko died, in detention under the same charges, under similar charges that Mangutjana was charged under just 7 years before. She doesn't die because they know if they went too far, the country would burn. Because she built, within a couple of years, had built a persona, exploited the fact that she's the wife of this towering man, and emerged and defined what that means, what it means to be the wife of this massive shadow. Because now he's reduced to the shadow, to this ghost, because he's incarcerated. And she uses that in a way that allows for people to just, engage the enemy in ways that they wouldn't have. I think women, when I think of wives, and I think people like Mangutjana, I think of people like Mamtsiki. These women, they carry ghosts. Mamtsiki, she carries, he's gone. So she carries a literal ghost. Because when people see her, they think, this woman that is the embodiment of dignity and this embodiment of the memory of her husband, blah, blah, blah. They don't quite see her. But she uses that in a way to continue the work. Because the way we think about black consciousness today is nothing without the work of people like Mamtsiki, who was so instrumental in reviving black consciousness, first quietly doing it within the platforms and the confines of, NGO work. And then you have, the Fallist movement just grabbing Biko out of the grave. And I think that becomes, that's possible because of this woman who carried this ghost with her. But I think with someone like Mam Winnie, because this man is still alive, in a way, he embodies that hope, and she's that person who exploits that idea of having hope and having faith that he'll be returned home, not just for the nation, but also for herself, because she wants her home to come back to normal as well. She speaks about it a lot when she, one of the things that she proposes when the Federation of Black Women is founded is these men must be released so that we as women and as wives in particular can just carry on our home life as normal. You know, so she's doing that in terms of the personal. Her activism is about restoring her home, restoring the black family, but also she's also is an important figure of restoring hope, of a hope of freedom for black people. So this idea of women taking it on, this idea of women emerging from their confines of the kitchen and caring for children, in particular, when we relate it particularly to Mam Winnie, becomes this moment where she's just this embodiment of this thing that is gonna come, that is going to be brought into existence, and not just a situation of sitting and praying and getting into prayer groups about it, but also a situation of going to work and bringing it into existence and ushering it into existence. And I think women and young people are such important figures of what that means, of what a faith with works means in relation to the struggle for liberation in this country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, as you were speaking, this notion that you keep bringing of Winnie, the way in which she came forth, right? Almost from the shadows. I think, again, of the story of Christ. Who were the first people to see and believe that he had resurrected? It was women. Right? It was women that, in fact, were the first people to tell that story, to tell the story of hope, of the possibility for salvation, for the possibility of a new imaginative possibility. It was women that were telling the story. So, of course, to me, the story of Christ is an important story for women to mobilize against, knowing the ways in which patriarchy often pushes them to the corners. They know that actually in the corners there is work to be done. And that is why they can always emerge out of that far stronger. You know, we had an event on the 8th of March on International Women's Day, and it was it was called The Work Women Do. And there we were talking about the ways in which care work and invisibilized work is not given any monetary value, is not given any legitimation, both financially and politically. And so this brings me to Ntabiseng Mutseme's work about that moment in the TRC, where all these women are busy doing small, invisibilized work, supposedly, right? Some are beading. Some are deeply quiet. Some are doing a variety of things that we do not legitimate often in the public sphere as political work. But here, women are doing care work at the TRC, when the women themselves are recognizing the complete erasure of their pain, of their struggle, and the possibilities for this conversation around forgiveness to be a legitimate one. Because forgiveness doesn't actually absolve the perpetrator. It can be, well, right? Like you can forgive someone legitimately and be like, okay, I need this for my peace. But the actual perpetrator is never and can't be resolved because they are still in the wrong. And so here women are doing all this kind of work. And to me, it's this shadow work that actually puts themselves back into the story, stitches themselves back into the story of South Africa, and really starts to contest, to me, this idea of erasure. And so I'm really interested in what you've said here about Winnie reconfiguring the home, the black home, because we know that that is the infrastructure of slavery, colonization, and apartheid to completely tear the black home apart. So when we were having this conversation initially about, what we were going to talk about, one of the things that you raised was trauma, right? And trauma because you say that, it was incredibly difficult for Winnie to realize that, in fact, her parents had anticipated a son, right? So we know the work of sons. we know how, fabulous sons have it in every variety of home, but women don't necessarily have that luxury. Can you give us a few, can you comment on that?
Okay. So I just want to, because we don't talk about this when we talk about Mum Winnie, the fact that her mother was under pressure to have a son. So they already had a firstborn son, but a second-born son is meant to inherit the mother's possessions. And, after this son is born, this firstborn son arrives, then just girls. And it's just not particularly the best thing for Mangutjana's parents, right? And, we also know, anybody who reads any of the work that's out there about her, about her life and so on, they know about her grandmother, Umakulseina, and how she was just putting pressure on Mangutjana's mother to just have this baby boy. So they're expecting this boy to arrive on the 26th of September, but out comes a girl. And that's why I think that when we think of Nomzamo, it's not so much, she talks about it, Mangutjana talks about her name as a prophetic thing. And in some ways there is that, right? But also there's something to be said. I think that names also speaks to the disappointment. Oh, well, we tried. We wanted a boy, but okay. And ironically, this girl that you thought, okay, fine, okay, there's a girl, whatever, becomes this person that not only becomes, this figure of a liberation movement, but becomes, in some ways, transforms this idea of a figurehead to an heir to freedom. So she becomes not just this thing that's relegated to just the confines of family and what it means to serve your purpose within your family and your clan. She emerges as this icon and this heir of, and not only just an heir, but somebody who brings forth a new era. Because we can never write about this new era without writing about her. And as much as people have tried to write her out of this period where we're sitting here right now is her inheritance. And so her name means so much more. In fact, not even just her name of, she became somebody who was probably the most tried of the liberation movement, and she was somebody who endured the most trial, which speaks to her name, but she also was, in terms of what her mother wanted or what her mother was pressured into bringing forth through birth, became this heir. And I think in a lot of ways, and even throughout her young life, her learning how to stick fight and emerging as one of the best, as the best in her area, as a stick fighter, defying those things, kind of also marks the ways when we think about her, when we think about her life, when we think about moments of refusal to confine herself to certain spaces, speaks to this trauma of being sort of rejected, of being okay, whatever, we'll make do with what we have, she's this person who defies all of that, who refuses to be just this wife, who refuses to function within the confines of, the Women's League. She's going to traverse it all. One of the things that Utata writes about in Long Walk is just when he talks about how he taught her to drive and so on, and how it ended in just a big fight because she wouldn't listen, he's teaching her to drive just before he goes underground. And he just gets out of the car, he slams his door and walks home. And she just drives herself back because she's just one of those people who's just like, you're not going to tell me what to do. My whole life I've had to prove myself. I've had to emerge. I've had to sort of fashion a life. I've had to fashion dignity for myself outside of spaces of being told that I'm not really quite adequate. And I think when we think about her activism, when we think about the ways that she amplifies the work of women under apartheid are not supposed to exist outside just as themselves. And she defies all of that, and she fashions a life for herself and also brings women into this fold, especially when she talks about women. You know, she brings them in and is like, you know, when you talk about me, you're going to talk about Florence Mposho. When you talk about me, if you want to have a conversation with me, you're going to talk about Lillian Ngoyi. You're going to talk about Florence Matomela, you know, because she knows what it is to be silenced. She knows what it is to sort of, you know, be met with a, okay, you know. And I think with her, she's just one of those people who, through that trauma, emerges, builds, and she built it for herself. She built it for herself. She built it for her children. She built it for us. She emerges as this heir and somebody who brings forth this new era, even though she's written out of. And I think our responsibility is to write her back into what she brought forth. Yeah.
Definitely. I'm going to start taking some questions. So Amanda Xulu says, Zikhona, may I ask what Winnie thought of FETSO, the Federation of South African Women, and we know that the anniversary of that is on the 17th of April, I think. And then, so there are quite a lot of comments I'm seeing, but not necessarily questions. But Precious Sharon Sinovuyo says she became the embodiment that made manifest the aspirations of Black people, of Black women. Perhaps I want to ask a question that connects the story of womanhood to the story of Blackness. I'm going to ask that question. And Untax says, beautiful point, revolution has many faces. It is so important to highlight this for the transition needed now. Youth and women came forth with homes a site of change, bottom up. And I think this to me is an important point given how I think of my generation and their refusal for the multifaceted ways in which patriarchy rears its ugly head, right? So I think of Zuma, for example, who will speak in parliament, or who did speak in parliament in English, all right? Speaks in English. Then when he's disciplining the nation, he speaks in his Zulu, right? And so there's something particularly interesting about the ways in which there is both a liberal, colonial formulation of patriarchy that Black women often have to fight against, and then traditional forms of patriarchy, right? Where we're told, you don't get place or space to speak about particular kinds of things. And so when we tell when I know I'm going to have a tough day at work, I put on a Winnie Mandela badge. It's just become my thing, right? Because I think there's something about drawing on this badge that doesn't actually have anything to do with anything, but it's a picture of this capacity for resilience. You know, that then emboldens me to, and so when she traverses through the cultural and the idiomatic and the symbolic because of the way that she fashions herself and the actual fashions of Winnie Mandela. So maybe do you remember the first two questions? Should I say them again? Sure. Uti Amanda, may I ask what Winnie thought of FETSO? Precious is asking, or rather saying, that she became the embodiment that made manifest the aspirations of black people and of black women. So we're speaking there about womanhood in relation to blackness. And then Untax has asked, or rather has said, revolution has many faces. It is so important to highlight this for the transition needed now. Youth and women came forth with homes as sites of change, bottom up, from the bottom up.
Okay. On the FEDSAW question, so these are the things. I mean, this is why she always mentions women alongside her. Like, that is the place that she first sort of, kind of went into, because we also have to think about a Winnie who, when she got married, she kind of took on this identity of her husband, was part of movements that her husband was a part of, so, FSAW was also, it was a movement of ANC women's leaguers. The first woman to serve as president of FSAW when it was founded was Umama Aida Mtwana. And there's a beautiful image of, because Umama Aida, she passed away I think in 1960, just around the time of the Sharpeville massacre. And you see there's an image of Umangutjana carrying as a pallbearer in that for her funeral, wearing the Women's League regalia. So she served in those in that movement. She also participated, because the Women's March is not just the work of women in terms of marching against passes, was not just in 1956, also in 1958. She was pregnant at the time, and so she's been a part of that. She's been a part of that movement, and the Women's League and so on. So there's not really an issue there or whatever. She was part of that, and and then I think with the movements being banned, and therefore there being a collapse of the Defiance campaign as a result, there are then new ways of sort of regrouping. When black consciousness emerges, women like Mangutjana, women like Fatima Mir and so on, become part of a movement of women who are hearing what the youth are saying, who are hearing what Steve Biko and them are saying, Tsietsi and so on are saying, and are therefore creating movements in response to the moment that black consciousness kind of brought to the fore. So the Black Parents Association, which she was a founding member of, which was led by people like Dr. Ntato Motlana and so on. The Federation of Black Women, which was founded in December of 1975 and was basically an important part of assisting students when June 16th happened 45 years ago. So I think FSAW, it became this movement that died after the Defiance campaign because of the bannings and so on, and then obviously it regroups in the 1980s when the UDF moment happens. But she got plugged into those things, especially after she was married to Utata. And then, what's the other question?
I also need to find the other question. The question connected to black people and black womanhood, or womanhood and black people.
What about it?
It was more a statement. She became the embodiment that made manifest the aspirations of black people.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this ties a lot into her work as a social worker. She was somebody who, she read. It's. I think I've said this before at another, at a conference somewhere, and where it was quite interesting to me to find how so much reading material was available. in South Africa, your Claude Lightfoots who were writing and theorizing about the Black Power movement in the United States. And, the work of, in one of her letters, that is actually in 491 Days, she quotes a line from Martin Luther King Jr., a line that we don't really, see much of when you look at some of his most famous sayings. So there was so much access and so much connection between Black people, across the global South. And, she was somebody who took all of those things to heart. When you walk into her house, the first thing you see is that collage of Malcolm X. And, she was somebody who was so inspired by that man and what the Black Power movement was trying to bring into existence in that space. And a lot of what the Black Power movement was about was just the bread and butter issues, the free breakfast programs, for example, and the thing that she does, Mangutjana, for example, specifically when she's in Brandfort, is to set up a clinic, to encourage people to plant gardens so that they can be self-sustaining, especially on the veggie front, and therefore to sort of nourish themselves. Those basic things, how she married her work, her expertise as a social worker with just the realities of Black people and also the aspirations of Black Power movements, kind of similar to what the Black community programs was trying to do under Black consciousness, how this particular space within the BCM was to develop and uplift Black people, and what she did as a social worker, because she's just so good at that and she's trained for that, is to really marry those concepts together. What does freedom mean if people are hungry? What does freedom mean? What does the fight for freedom mean if I am going to the picket on an empty stomach? If I'm going to the picket with a weak health? What does that mean, fighting for these things, picketing, but my children have no one to care for them? And that's why she had a creche, to help women, go to work, earn an income, feed their children, but also with the peace of mind that they were safe in the care of a social worker. So I think those sort of things, I think the ways in which she married those issues with the ideological stuff, the bread and butter issues with the ideological stuff. And then on to your point, I've spoken about this, I've written about this as well, in terms of the ways, she kind of defied the confines of, what it is to engage in the struggle as a woman. A lot of how the political organizations are organized, not just in terms of the religious aspect, is also just in terms of, certain African homes in the rural villages, how, the men have so much access to the home. Any area of the home is a space that they can access. Women are limited. They can never go ebuhlanti. Ubuhlanti is the gathering of the men, right? Isibaya or whatever, right? And Mam Winnie was one of those things. And I feel like in the political organizations, people treat leadership in political organizations, masculinity within these spaces is treated like ubuhlanti. Leadership is treated like ubuhlanti, where this is an untouched space. It's a sacred space that only men can engage in, only men can sort of participate in. And Mam Winnie, one of the things that makes her not just an enemy of the state, but an enemy of her own movement, is that she doesn't care for that. She's going to enter that space. She's going to enter that sacred space. Because we know that ubuhlanti is also a sacred space, is a space of communion, right, with the spiritual realm, right, for people who hold to those beliefs. And she knows, and for her activism, how she engages and how she navigates the movement is to go straight there. She doesn't need somebody to be some kind of, a bridge between her, a proxy. She goes straight in, and that's one of the reasons why she is sort of seen quite early, detected, especially in the 80s, as somebody who is who's an enemy of her own movement. And I think it's because of, and when we write about Dada, right, we talk about how he was so married to the struggle. Well, newsflash, his wife was married to it too. And that is her ultimate devotion. So she's not going to hear from anybody else about how to navigate her marriage to the movement, her marriage to the cause of freedom. She's not going to hear from anybody else, including her husband. And that's how we should engage the ways in which she engages with certain aspects of liberation, of engaging, the enemy, right? That is her, and it speaks to what we were saying, her pursuit of fellowship. She's in the ways, because she is so confined in terms of she can't really engage in conventional ways. Church for her can't be limited to a confined space like this, because she can't enter it during her struggle, right? So church for her becomes the liberation movement. Communion for her becomes the fight for liberation. Communion for her becomes the spaces, at funerals. Those funerals become transformed as sites of intellectual production, and she does that. Sites of connecting with the ideologies and the ideologies of a pursuit of freedom, and that's where she communes. That's her spiritual place. That's her seventh heaven. So I think those are the ways in which she sort of defies the confines of what it is to sort of, especially in a movement like the ANC, where it's all cut out and clear cut about where people sort of belong. And we also know in the church, when I think of the church, right, and I think of when people greet, when they make announcements, Diabolisa ko tata, ko mama, ulucha, ne Sunday school. You see that, like, already those compartments. Mama Winnie doesn't do that. She's found everywhere. And I think, just to add, when I think of the fashion, when we're talking just now, when you were talking about just literally her fashion, Mum Winnie, somebody who was so censored in her lifetime, uses her fashion as not just her pen but her mic, to sort of amplify her work and what she stands for throughout her activism. And the fact that the thing that we are left with, the one image that we are left with, I think we take it for granted today because we take selfies and all of that. But the one image we are finally left with around Easter Sunday is her wearing ibhaji yakhe as a church woman, as a woman of faith. That is her mic drop is so important for the conversation that we are having. The idea of her having, even when she had lost her faith in times of solitary confinement and banishment, there were whispers of that. And finally, finally in her last moments, this is the thing she leaves us with, this thing that has sustained her, and in ways that she also had a hand in terms of fashioning it to fit a liberation politics, is so important. And is something that should remain with us, and we should think about and theorize around more seriously in our work and pursuit of reinstating her to where she belongs as a liberator and a revolutionary.
Come on. I feel like I'm in church. I feel like I need to keep going. Come on. Zukona, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the notion of the bride of Christ the entire time that you were speaking. And, in fact, that is the call, right? Again, people that are watching at home, this is not an evangelical moment.
It's not TBN.
It's not TBN. It's to take seriously what it is, the context in which this woman emerges. But biblically, the bride of the Christ is told to be the salt of the earth, right? And salt does two things. It gives flavor and it also heals. But when you put salt, it is not a good time, right? And I think about that conception of salt of the earth when I think about women like Winnie, right? Who are actually unpalatable. But if you stick with it, they will lead to a liberation. If you stick with it, they will in fact lead to your healing. I think there's something so profound about the fact that our most prominent liberators are interested in care work. You know, I think about the fact that Frans Fanon took seriously the minds of folks in Algeria, that Biko took seriously the ailments, the physical ailments of black people during apartheid. And then, of course, we have Winnie, who is a social worker, who, in my mind, the social worker is such a profoundly important thing, and you've already spoken about it, but it configures the societal component to it, right? It doesn't just do the science. And I think that's so profound for me because Winnie, in that sense, is doing the decolonial project, right? Which is to marry again the fact that knowledges are interconnected. So when the ANC tells us that they don't want to give money to the humanities, that is in direct contradiction, and tell us, oh my God, the STEM subjects are so important. But in fact, the STEM subjects are the answers to the questions that humanities grads asked. And so partly the ways in which Winnie is as a social worker is to take seriously historiography, is to take seriously political economy, is to take seriously the brutality of apartheid in the ways in which it completely breaks down the African home. I'm curious about your thoughts about what healers are and what this means for Winnie. And this is in closing.
I think, linking that with, my answer with your point about the salt of the earth, they don't just add flavor. Salt doesn't just add flavor, doesn't just heal, it also preserves. And I think, her life, Winnie, was about preserving the Mandela name and the name of the ANC in the consciousness of black people. She's the reason this thing called the ANC, this name called Mandela, doesn't drift into an abyss of irrelevance. And I think also just in terms of applying the idea of the healer in her work, she's not just somebody who spoke about had these conversations about what people were going through. She was also, putting in the work, as confined as she was, as up against the wall as she was, because after the apartheid state, the first thing it does when you are an activist is to attack you economically. And that's what they did. That's something that Madiba understood, right? As a lawyer, he at some point couldn't work. And when they as a couple had a conversation and she was like, well, I'm going to be part of the movement. That's the first thing he said. Well, right now you're the breadwinner and they're going to come for you. They're going to come for you there specifically, right? That's the first thing they're going to attack. It didn't deter her, and she did the work because she also understood that the work of freedom was social work. It's not just about, we want to vote. We want land. We want, equal participation in the and an economy that respects our dignity as black people. So this thing of an exploitative, there's something that's got to sort of be reorganized in our country, because the reality of the South African economy is that it's built on exploitation. From slavery in 1658 to apartheid. And so her work was always involved with finding ways of reorganizing, labor for the benefit of the dignity of black people. And I think that is what it meant to be to be salt of the earth. Because I think when you put flavor into something, it transforms that thing. And that's what she was doing with her work, you know? And I also think that, yeah, and I think there's a lot more that I want to say, and there's a lot more that I want to think about. But I think when it comes to her, we need to think a lot about the ways in which, you know, she was so interested in preserving this name that she was married into, this movement that she was a part of, for the benefit of Black people, for the benefit of getting those STEM answers from the questions that her activism asked.
Zukona. Oh man, we are so honored. We are so honored. We are so deeply honored to live in a time such as this, where your political precision is so undeniable, and your clarity and your capacity is so undeniable. We are so thankful for your generosity, because you must be generous to be able to think so seriously about the lives of Black people. You must be generous to think so seriously about the capacity for freedom for Black people. So thank you for honoring us today. The Forge has had many conversations, has had many things happen. But this was so edifying for so many different reasons. And so thank you so much. We honor you. We honor Madikizela Mandela, Ututhandiswa Mazai, Kawe Lama Kawe, and we put you in the same lineage. So thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone who's watched at home. We thank you for your participation. I couldn't get to all the comments and the questions, but thank you. Thank you for the love and taking seriously Zukona's work today. Next time, see us on the Commune JHB channel. There's so many exciting things that are happening tomorrow and on Friday, and as the month carries on. Thank you so much, and have a beautiful evening. And for those of you who are watching later, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you.